The following teaching is possible thanks to the friends and partners of Spirit and Truth Fellowship International.
Where are we? Yeah, we're at Lachish. We're at Lachish, and this, as you can see, I mean, look at the slope of this city. Look at the fortifications of this. Of course, this is a tell. It goes back a very, very long time. We'll read in Joshua chapter 10 that this was a Canaanite city long before it was an Israelite city. It was one of the most powerfully fortified cities in all of Israel, and which you can tell. I mean, look at that. Look at the fortifications that we see just in what we can see. It's also a rather major tell. Something that I'd like to point out, by the way, notice how the entrance road goes along the base of the tell. Do you see how the entrance road to the city goes along parallel to the base of the tell? What would be the reason for that? Yeah, defense, because your army, if you're going to attack the city, if you put the road going straight up to it, juke, then the army that's charging you can get a nice long run and hit your gates right away, and meanwhile you don't have much of a shot at them. But if you put the road along the base of the tell, then if they're going to take the road, then they've got to go for this prolonged distance right where they're open to all of your attack from the side. From their side is completely open to your attack. So that's the reason for doing that. So the particular gates and towers of Lachish are extremely well built for fortification. If we go back to Joshua chapter 10, we'll see Lachish early on is one of the major cities of the Canaanites. And this would be in the realm of 1400 BC. Joshua chapter 10, verse 1. Now Adoni-Zedek, and of course Adonai is Lord, so Lord Zedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had taken Ai and totally destroyed it, doing to Ai and its king as he had done to Jericho and its king. And the people of Gibeon had made a treaty of peace with Israel and were living near them. He and his people were very much alarmed at this because Gibeon was an important city, like one of the royal cities. It was larger than Ai, and all of its men were good fighters. So Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, appealed to Hoham, king of Hebron, Piram, king of Jarmuth, Japhia, king of Lachish. And then it's going to go on. King of Lachish, Debir, king of Eglon, come up and help me attack Gibeon, he said, because it has made peace with Joshua and the Israelites. Now this is a fantastic record, and it's well worth reading. It was in this battle that Joshua said, "Sun, stand thou still over Gibeon, moon over the valley of Adullam." Gibeon and Adullam are just a few miles to the north of us. And of course, if the sun were to stand still right now, it's right overhead, so the sun could be over Gibeon pretty quickly. It'd just be, if you were looking a little behind, boom, the sun would be right over Gibeon just about now, actually, this time of day. So Joshua conquered Lachish, and Lachish became an Israelite city. Now, if you want to take a look at where I think I'd like to go, is I'd like to go to 2 Chronicles chapter 11. And in 2 Chronicles chapter 11, we'll read about Rehoboam. This is after Solomon died. 2 Chronicles chapter 11, verse 9. Rehoboam lived in Jerusalem and built up towns for defense in Judah: Bethlehem, Etam, Tekoa, Beth Zur, Soco, Adullam, Gath, Mareshah, Ziph, Adoraim, and Lachish. There it is, Hezekiah, Zorah, Eglon, and Hebron. These were fortified cities in Judah and Benjamin. And some of these fortifications that were excavated would date from the time of Rehoboam. So again, Rehoboam was Solomon's son, and one of the things he's going to do is fortify this city. Does it look like a good position to fortify? Absolutely. Look at the slopes and look at the layout of this city. What a fabulous place to fortify. You can see why a king would want to do that. Now, in the history of Israel, the Israelites sinned against God, and a kingdom called Assyria attacked Israel. And it carried it conquered Israel. Assyria conquered Israel in about 722 BC and carried the Israelites captive. Now, that's when the 10 tribes of Israel were lost. By the way, what happened was the Assyrians brought people from other kingdoms they had conquered and settled them in Israel. And those foreigners living in Israel were the progenitors of what we knew in the New Testament as the Samaritans. If you want to know why did everybody hate the Samaritans, it's because they were living in Israel, but they weren't Israelites. They weren't from Israel. They were brought in by the Assyrians. After conquering Israel in 722, the Assyrians decided to attack Judah. The person who was the king at the time was a man named Hezekiah. Hezekiah was the king of Judah when the Assyrians attacked. But I'd like to go to Micah just a second and read something from the book of Micah. Let's go to Micah chapter 1. Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Jonah, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah. Let's see. There we are, Micah chapter 1. And in verse 8, Micah says, because of this sin, I will weep and wail. I will go about barefoot and naked. I will howl like a I will howl like a jackal and moan like an owl, for her wound is incurable. It has come to Judah. And I think that's interesting that it has come to Judah, that the idolatry kind of crept into Judah. It has reached the very gate of my people, even to Jerusalem itself. He goes on in verse 13, and he says, you who live in Lachish, harness the team to the chariot. You, meaning, get ready to run, get ready to flee. And Micah, of course, predated the destruction of, he lived during the time of, he lived during Ahaz, Hezekiah. But this prophecy would predate the attack of Assyria on Judah. But here he says, you who live in Lachish, harness the team to the chariot, meaning prepare to flee, prepare to run. For the transgressions, you were the beginning of sin to the daughter of Zion. And I think that's interesting that it would say that. You were the beginning of sin to the daughter of Zion. For the transgressions of Israel were found in you. Well, what were the transgressions of Israel? There's idolatry, the golden calves, and that kind of thing. So what is being stated even before the Assyrians came through this area was that Lachish, being a very, very powerful city, a fortified city, and a cultural city, and of course, it just seems to go with the territory that when you have a lot of culture, what happens to morals and things? They go downhill. It's very interesting how that happens. But sin seems to read the cutting edge of the fine. Sin, I just can't seem to talk this afternoon. Sin seems to ride the cutting edge of the fine arts. I don't know why that is. But painters just so often aren't happy painting just a person. They've got to paint something weird and wild and God knows what, and you get all kinds of nudity and weird stuff in the theater and in the fine arts and whatever. So here Lachish is this very powerful, very fortified city, a city that God called the beginning of sin for Judah. In other words, there were a lot of practices that came to Lachish that then later got up to Judah. Now, what happened in Lachish? Well, the Assyrian commander, Sennacherib, or the king of Assyria, Sennacherib, when he brought his armies through Judah, conquered many of the cities in Judah. Just conquered city after city. He had an unbelievably powerful war machine. And he started to conquer Lachish. Now we're in Chronicles, so let's go to 2 Chronicles chapter 32. In 2 Chronicles chapter 32, in verse 1, somewhere, okay, we'll just start in verse 1. Chapter 32, verse 1, after all that Hezekiah had so faithfully done, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and invaded Judah. He laid siege to the fortified cities, thinking to conquer them for himself. So Sennacherib comes into the land to attack Judah, to destroy it, to carry it away, just like he'd done with Israel. And he was laying siege to the fortified cities. Verse 2, when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come and that he intended to make war on Jerusalem, he consulted with his officials and military staff about blocking off the water from the springs outside the city, and they helped him. A large force of men assembled, and they blocked all the springs and the stream that flowed through the land. Why should the kings of Assyria come and find plenty of water, they said. And when he was blocking the springs off outside the city still needed water, so what did he do? Yes, he cut a tunnel into the city. We call that Hezekiah's tunnel. The pool at the end of the tunnel we call the Pool of Siloam, right. So verse 5, he says he worked hard repairing all the broken sections of the wall and building towers. He built another wall outside that one. And that, remember we saw the wall outside the original city wall. We saw that in the city yesterday. It was called the Broad Wall, but it goes back to the time of Hezekiah. He reinforced the supporting terraces of the city of David. He also made large numbers of weapons and shields. Verse 6, he appointed military officers over the people and assembled them before him in the square at the city gate and encouraged them with these words, be strong and courageous, don't be afraid or discouraged because of the king of Assyria and the vast army with him. For there is a greater power with us than with him. With him only is the arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and fight our battles. And the people gained confidence from what Hezekiah, the king of Judah, said. And that is, it's important that we encourage one another in life. Notice how the people were encouraged here by Hezekiah. So interesting to see through the scripture the number of times that someone's words encouraged somebody else. Verse 9, later, when Sennacherib, king of Assyria, and all his forces were laying siege to where? To Lachish. Later, when Sennacherib, king of Assyria, and all his forces were laying siege to Lachish, he sent his officers to Jerusalem with this message for Hezekiah, king of Judah, and for all the people of Judah who were there. So he's laying siege to Lachish, Sennacherib is. And he sends to where? Jerusalem, which is where Hezekiah was. Now it's interesting that the Assyrians conquered Lachish. It took them a long time to do it, but they conquered Lachish. And I thought I brought a couple things. The Oxford Bible Atlas, by the way, this is the Oxford Bible Atlas. And the Oxford Bible Atlas has an illustration because when the king of Assyria conquered Lachish, I mean, take a look at the fortifications. He was so proud of the accomplishment that he went back home to his capital city in Nineveh, and he had entire walls of his palace cut in bas relief with the siege of Lachish. Now those have been found and they've been carried off to various museums, and you can see that at various museums around the world. where the Assyrian king was so proud of the destruction of this city because of its huge fortifications. And these rock cuts, and it's hard for you to see them here, but these rock cuts depict the siege of the city. So you see arrows and bowmen and slingers, and you also see something else that I had blown up a little bit, and that is, you see the first form really of the earliest form of crucifixion goes back to the Assyrian army, or the Assyrian time. The Assyrians came out of what we now know is Persia. In the Roman Empire it was Parthia. But the law of Moses said that you stoned a criminal to death and then you hung his body on a tree, but the body was dead at that time. The Assyrians were the first ones to set up poles, and then they would stick live people on them. Now at that time you weren't tied to them or whatever, they actually stuck you on the pole. But but the siege of Lachish is portrayed, and in the rock cut of the siege of Lachish, you can see these people stuck on a pole. Now what that tells me is that, this would be close to the city gate. That tells me to within 100, 200 yards easily of where we're sitting today, that 2,700 years ago, human beings were shoved alive on a pole and killed. Right here. This city was sieged for months, right here. Now when the excavation was done of Lachish, one of the things that was found were letters. Now I should say that the Assyrians conquered Lachish, and then when they got to Jerusalem, they were going to conquer Jerusalem, but what happened? What happened to their army? Their army was killed. We should take a look at that in the book of Kings. Well, we're in Chronicles. If you don't want to move, it's in Chronicles also. Let's see. Well, no, we need to go to Kings. So we go to 2 Kings, probably 18 or 19. Okay. 2 Kings 18, okay. 2 Kings 19, and in chapter 30, in 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 35, and this is after Isaiah's prayer and Hezekiah's prophecy. Verse 35 says, that night the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 men in the Assyrian camp. That's a lot of soldiers. When the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, broke camp and did what? Withdrew. He returned to Nineveh and stayed there. One day while he was worshiping in the temple of his god Nisroch, his sons Adramelech and Sharezer cut him down with a sword, and they escaped to the land of Ararat. And Esarhaddon, his son, succeeded him as king. And it's true that Sennacherib was succeeded by Esarhaddon. So during the siege of in the battle of the Assyrians versus the Judeans, about 700 BC, when Hezekiah was the king, Lachish was a prize city. When the Assyrians took this, they were very proud because of the power that they had. As soon as the Assyrian army was dead and went home, and the rest of them went home, then what do you think the Judeans came back and did? Right. Exactly. The Judeans, the Assyrians went home defeated, their army killed by the might of the Lord. The Judeans came right back and refortified the city because, again, they couldn't just leave it. It was an absolutely key city. If you look at Jeremiah chapter 34, now Jeremiah chapter 34 is written during a different time period, a different kingdom. What kingdom is attacking Judah now? The Babylonians are attacking Judah. Exactly. Thanks, Steve. The Babylonians are attacking Judah, and the king is not Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, but Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king. And in Jeremiah chapter 34, it says, Then Jeremiah the prophet told all this to Zedekiah king of Judah in Jerusalem. Verse 7, while the army of the king of Babylon was fighting against Jerusalem and the other cities of Judah that were still holding out. So the Babylonian army, a huge military force, came through, and it was easy to take most of the cities of Judah, but there were a few that would be difficult to conquer. One, of course, would be Jerusalem. And what do you think about Lachish? Probably tough to conquer. And so what do you know? Here in Jeremiah chapter 34, it says, while the army of the king of Babylon was fighting against Jerusalem and the other cities of Judah that were still holding out, Lachish and Azekah, these were the only fortified cities left in Judah. So when Nebuchadnezzar attacked and destroyed Judah, Azekah and Lachish managed to hold out the longest. So when you look at these fortifications, you can see why that would be. When Lachish was excavated, they actually found letters in Lachish from the time of the Babylonian siege. And these letters were written on pieces of clay jars, which were broken, and because of that there are pieces missing. But if you can go back with me now to about 2,586 years, around in that area, to the siege of Lachish, when all of Judah was covered with the invading army of the Babylonians, and things were getting pretty bad, we hear from a person named Hoshea. And he's in Lachish. I'm sorry, he's not in Lachish. A guy named Joash is in Lachish, and he's the commander. And there's a servant named Hoshea, and he's out in one of the other cities. And he says to my lord Joash, again, Joash is in Lachish, may Yahweh cause my lord to hear tidings of peace this very day. Who is thy servant but a dog, that my lord hath remembered his servant? May Yahweh afflict those who report an evil rumor about which thou art not informed. Now these are little pieces of a letter, and what it's saying is that there's trouble brewing in Judah, and what is the trouble? The letters don't exactly say. Then the next letter, thy servant Hoshea hath sent to inform my lord Joash. May Yahweh cause my lord to hear tidings of peace. And now thou hast sent a letter, but my lord did not enlighten thy servant concerning the letter which thou didst send to thy servant yesterday evening. Though the heart of thy servant has been sick, since thou didst write to thy servant. And as for what my lord said, dost thou not understand, call a scribe? As Yahweh lives, no one has ever undertaken to call a scribe for me. Apparently, Joash in Lachish thought that he couldn't read what was written, because apparently orders were getting confused. So he said, call a scribe. And the guy says, I don't have a scribe. He says, as for any scribe who might have come to me, truly I did not call him, nor would I give anything at all for him. And it hath been reported to thy servant, saying, the commander of the host, Coniah, son of Elnathan, hath come down in order to go into Egypt. And unto Hodaviah, son of Ahijah, and his men hath he sent to obtain, and then something. As for the letter of Tobiah, servant of the king, which came to Shalom, son of Jehudah, through the prophet, saying, beware, thy servant hath sent it to my lord. Now that's interesting. The army of Nebuchadnezzar is attacking. What's Jeremiah saying? He's saying, beware of the army, don't fight, do what? Surrender. So either Jeremiah's words are getting out, and these guys out here in the fortifications are hearing about them, or there are other prophets besides Jeremiah that are speaking the same thing. It's interesting now to see the contrast, because what happened to Jeremiah? He was captured and thrown in prison for being a traitor. See, from our standpoint, looking back 2,500 years, we know it was the will of the Lord to surrender. Jeremiah is walking around saying the Babylonians are going to win. You guys are going to lose this. If you fight, you're going to lose. Surrender to the Babylonians. We, looking back 2,500, almost 2,600 years and not particularly involved, are thinking, why weren't the people listening to the prophet? But the people in the army are saying, for Pete's sake, their prophets walking around and they're weakening the hands of the people. Instead of people being strong to fight, they're being weakened by these prophets walking around telling them they're going to lose. So the prophets, they are walking around. It's just, what's your point of view? And that's very much like life. That there's all different kinds of people saying, this is true, this is true, this is true. And there is truth out there. We've just got to find it. Then he writes again, may Yahweh cause my Lord to hear this very day tidings of good. And now, according to everything that my Lord hath written, so hath thy servant done. I've written on the door according to all that my Lord hath written to me. And with respect to what my Lord hath written about the matter of, and then there's a Hebrew word that apparently they can't translate, there's no one there. And as for Shemaiah hath taken him and hath brought him up to this city. And as for your servant, I am not sending anyone there today, but I will send someone tomorrow morning. And then remember now that the Babylonians are attacking the whole country. He says, and let my Lord know that we are watching for the signals from Lachish. Did you see how far away we could see that smoke signal, that smoke? They would send smoke and fire signals. Now here's a little tiny fortification out in the battlefield. Here's Lachish, this beautifully fortified city. And he writes to the commander Joash and Lachish, and he says, look, we're waiting for signals from you, because he says, from the signals of Lachish, according to all the indications which my Lord hath given, for we cannot see Hezekiah. What had happened to Hezekiah? It had already gone down, already fallen to the Babylonians. Then he writes, he says, may Yahweh cause my Lord to hear tidings of peace and good this very day. Who is thy servant but a dog, that thou hast sent to thy servant the letters? Now your servant has returned the letters to my Lord. May Yahweh cause thee to see. And then it kind of trails off. Then he writes again to my Lord Joash, may Yahweh cause my Lord to see this season in good health. Who is thy servant but a dog, that my Lord hath sent me a letter of the king and letters of the princes, saying, pray read them. And behold, the words of the princes are not good, but weaken our hands, and slacken the hands of the men who were informed about them. And now, my Lord, wilt thou not write to them, saying, why do thus even in Jerusalem? Why do ye thus even in Jerusalem? Behold, unto the king and unto his house are ye doing this thing. And as Yahweh thy God lives, truly, since thy servant has read the letters, there has been no peace for thy servant. Then his next letter, may Yahweh cause my Lord to hear tidings of good this very day. The Lord hath humbled me before thee. Nebadiah hath fled to the mountains. Truly I lie not. Let my Lord send thither. And it's interesting, so here's somebody that all around him, the kingdoms are falling, the cities are falling, and so here's and he must have been a fairly high in the army, because he says, truly I lie not. Let my Lord send thither. So some army officer bailed on this place and ran off to the mountains to avoid being killed by the Babylonian army. And he's writing to his Lord about it, and he's saying, look, I'm not lying about this. The guy really ran away. So these of course talk about the decaying situation in Babylon as in Judea, as the Babylonian army continued to encroach upon Judah. And of course, did Lachish finally fall to the Babylonians? Yes, it did. And so did Jerusalem. And of course, the temple was burned. When the temple was burned by the Babylonians, that ended the first temple period. First temple period from Solomon to Nebuchadnezzar. Second temple period from Ezra till the Jewish revolt and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So it's interesting that these letters were found right in there, written by a commander of, or no, not, they were found in here, but they were written by a commander of a little outpost that was trying to hold his post while the Babylonian army encroached on Judah. And I think it's interesting the way that he views the words of the prophets as words that will weaken the hands of the people. We read the words of the prophets and think, boy, why didn't they listen to the Word of God? It's so interesting the way that works. When we talk about Jesus Christ, we think we're teaching the truth. In fact, we know we're teaching the truth. We're teaching the truth. We're holding forth the truth. We're showing people the way of salvation. Other people look at us and they say, boy, are you guys narrow-minded? You know, so it's perspective. It's always perspective. But this is Lachish, and it's a pleasure for me to be here. I've never been to Lachish before, and it's awesome to get to see what an interesting sight this is.